Welcome to BP Mindcast. I'm Jonathan Bartlett, your host. These podcasts cover a wide variety of topics from a conservative academic viewpoint. Some you'll find interesting, some you won't. Hopefully, I plan on keeping these short enough that you can easily enjoy what you like, and hopefully I won't keep you too long for those that you don't. Today I want to talk about the question of whether or not science is fundamentally naturalistic. And so a lot of people, even from the conservative side, tend to say, oh yes, for sure, science is naturalistic. Now, and but I would actually argue that at its core, naturalism is one of two things. It is either completely wrong, and it has been a negative for the history of science, at least, or it is meaningless. One of those two must be true. And you can get that by actually looking at the history of naturalism and the history of the term. So, for instance, if naturalism has had to change over and over and over again for science to be naturalistic, then the term is meaningless, because if it's just changing, and it's not actually being a guide, it's just being a follower, then really naturalism isn't helpful at all to determine what is or is not scientific. If, on the other hand, if naturalism gives a hard and fast rule, but science has had to break that rule, then we can see that naturalism is not helpful for science, that it's actually detrimental to science. So naturalism could only be helpful for science if it provides hard and fast rules for science, and those rules have been followed faithfully to bring about the science that we have today. So the question is has naturalism itself, has that definition stayed steady throughout the years? And actually, what it turns out is that at the beginning of what we call modern science, which is the Newtonian revolution, that there was actually a big disagreement about naturalism at that time. In fact, the thing that was claimed to be non-naturalistic and therefore non-scientific was actually Newtonian mechanics itself. See, what happened is that during Newton's time, what was considered to be naturalistic were that all causation had to happen by things touching each other, that it was considered to be an occult force or a mystical force if two things could influence each other without touching. And so that's why so all the materialists all proposed mechanisms for things to happen where that every cause and every effect were the result of direct touching. But Newton, and the reason for that is because if there isn't a physical way that two objects can interact, then what is it that causes them to interact? Newton came up with gravity, and gravity specifically goes against this idea. And in gravity, you actually have action at a distance. And so the reason why Newton was able to posit this idea is because he considered causation to be happening in the mind of God. And so he considered any valid cause to be a cause, to be something that God, that could be something that was logically consistent, that God could mediate with his own mind. That sort of cause is all you need to have causation. While as the naturalists, they wanted to say no, only things that touch can have influence. And so therefore you actually have the people who were arguing against Newton at the beginning were arguing against Newton on the basis of naturalism, saying that Newtonian mechanics, which today is kind of the sine qua non of naturalism, it was proposed at the time to not be naturalistic. And in fact, in the letters between Leibniz and Clarke, there was an argument as to whether or not Newtonian mechanics was qualified as science because it was not naturalistic. And Leibniz was basically saying because there was nothing physical that prevents something from moving in a certain way, that gravity couldn't do it, because then you'd have to invoke an occult force. And so you see that even at the very dawn of science, the thing that held, so the thing that it was what worked, not what was classified as naturalism, which became science. And so they actually had to change the definition of naturalism in order to accommodate Newtonian mechanics. So then later you have the definition of naturalism is that anytime you have causation, where you can determine the effects precisely from the causes. And so you have the fact that uh, under under Newtonian mechanics, you can basically plug everything into equation and get the result back. And so this was then what was considered naturalistic in the 1800s. But along comes quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics again violates the ideals of naturalism by saying no. Um, we there is not a way to come from to have a deterministic equation that goes from uh, observable states to the next state in the path. That there's a probability there, but there's not a deterministic method there. So again, you have a breaking of naturalism. So you can see that every major change in science actually breaks what the previous generation thought of naturalism. And note that I'm not referring to specific laws or anything like that. I'm referring to general ideas. So you can see that naturalism has actually done nothing at all to progress science. What naturalism winds up being is simply a catalog of what used to work in the past. And so as new things come to work, they just get thrown into naturalism. So naturalism, if you say naturalism has a hard and fast meaning, well, you'd have to pick somewhere along the line to say, oh, it has this meaning. And basically, anytime for the last 400 years, any definition you picked would wind up being wrong. So the fact that the idea that today's definition of naturalism, yes, that we can't cross that one for sure, because this is a time-honored tradition that science can't be non-naturalistic. Well, that's just ridiculous, because naturalism itself has been continually changing with science. And so, if naturalism just means everything that's worked so far, well, we don't know what's going to work in the future. And so whatever we propose today, if it winds up working, we'll call it naturalistic. And so this is also why I find ridiculous the idea people say, oh, well, science gets bigger and bigger and religion gets smaller and smaller. And that's also ridiculous, because what's actually been happening is that theology has actually provided the mental tools to help science progress. Science has progressed not because religion has been getting smaller, but because science has been embracing different aspects of theology. And as it embraces different aspects of theology, science does in fact get bigger. But since it's embracing theology, this is not at theology's expense. This is on using theology as a footstool. Because if you think about it, these sorts of ideas, non-local causation, that comes from theology. You have the idea that non-determinism, that also comes from theology. So you have all the major different aspects of science as it goes forward are actually being inherited from theology. They're not controverting theology. They're not taking the place of theology. They're embracing theology. And so you see that naturalism is not helping science at all. If anything, it's just kind of a general throwaway term that represents science as we've discovered it so far, no matter what that is. So if you ever use naturalism to mean a boundary for science, what you're actually doing is preventing science from making progress, because you're saying you're not allowed to find out things that are different from what we've determined before. And so that's why I find naturalism is not actually an effective it's not really an effective or interesting or helpful limitation on science. It doesn't help science. It might describe what science does right now, but that's because that's its definition. Whatever science does right now, that's naturalism. It doesn't help as a boundary point, because if we ever used it as a boundary point, we wouldn't have been able to move forward. And so if we use it as a boundary point now, the same thing's going to happen. We won't be able to move forward. And so anyway, so I think we should, if we want to use naturalism to describe where we are, if you want to. But to use naturalism as a limitation on what scientists should do or discover, I think is absolutely ridiculous and goes against the history of science. Hope you enjoyed your time on BP Mindcast. Until next time, keep thinking.